Hello. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say thank you very much to Jerwood Film and Video Umbrella for inviting me to speak. I'm very happy to be part of this day, and I think it's been really interesting so far. I think what I wanted to do was to try and refer to some of the things everybody had said in one way or another, but I also wanted to try and relate it to my own position and how I feel about futurity. So I've put something together which, as Francis mentioned, is called On Time, Concentration and Supermarkets. In the summer of 1993, I had a job as a checkout girl in a supermarket called William Lowe at Cannon Mills in Edinburgh. I say girl because we were all girls. It was stipulated that we had to wear American tan tights under our nylon dresses, so we positively cracked with static. I was saving up to go to university in October, and I spent a fair amount of time in between customers thinking about how that would be. When a customer would arrive at my till, though, the pressure was on to try to scan the barcodes on their shopping as fast as possible. William Lowe monitored how quickly you processed each pile of shopping and posted charts each week in the staff room ranking their employees. Throughout the time that I worked there, I was consistently last. Most of the customers were women, pensioners buying small rations like a few slices of pork luncheon meat and a tin of condensed milk, or harassed mothers dashing in after the school drop-off to load up with another week's worth of breakfast, packed lunches and dinners. It was easy to imagine the lives behind the shopping, and also, too, to imagine the difficulties that might be inherent in those lives as I weighed their fresh produce on my scale or waited for them to count out the coins into my hand, or held down a thin paper receipt for them to sign. If they had paid by card, I had to compare the signature on their card with the signature on the paper before filing it away in my till. So I knew the names of most of the customers as they knew mine, emblazoned as it was on my employee badge. Melissa Gronlund, in her essay, What Passes Us By, which is included in the newspaper that you'll find just outside the door of the exhibition downstairs and published to coincide with the exhibition, asks, how do we anticipate the future and how do we design it? This is something we are doing all the time, sending feedback to the makers of our iPhones and our Apple software, to the Google algorithms that supply the answers to our numerous daily questions, such that they determine the extent of our everyday imaginary. But that everyday imaginary, as generations of women know, is often more important than our highbrow one. To the newspapers we read and online bookshops that we browse, which in turn suggest to us articles and publications we might like, such that they determine our view of the world. To the supermarkets in which we regularly shop, such that they determine the food we eat. To a remarkable degree, and with a remarkable degree of passivity, we are shaping our small experiences of the future. The year after I left Edinburgh, William Lowe was bought over by Tesco, one of the big four supermarkets that command 76.2% of the UK grocery market. I haven't been back there to assess the changes, but I'm guessing a significant proportion of the tills are self-service tills. Payments will be mainly made with chip and pin, so no one knows anyone's name, although if they insert their Tesco club card in the slot, they're tacitly agreeing to information about their shopping habits being recorded, which in turn will shape their supermarket experiences of the future. No one signs credit and debit card slips anymore, so that moment of concentrating, of producing a representative signature that has to be studied by the operator, has also vanished. The avatar character in Ed Atkins' prequel to Warm Spring Mouths, called Material Witness or A Liquid Cop 2011, which is also on display downstairs, reflects that my longhand is only now required if I need to sign something, an increasingly rarefied experience. Writing my signature, such a seemingly simple representation of self, now feels slow and dumb, a process guided by a blind and obstinate hand. Longhand has been replaced by the swipe, the pinch, the tab, the trace, the jab, and the drag. I think that's not exactly in the right order, but something like that. My stepson is 22, and like Simon Reynolds' son that he mentioned earlier, is also a digital native. And he is a software developer and a startup enthusiast, and he now lives in Silicon Valley in California. And on one of his visits home a year or two ago, I mentioned to Finbar that I felt sad for the old people who were increasingly faced with self-checkout tills in supermarkets. I felt, and I still feel, that the urban environment must present an increasingly alienating situation to many elderly people, with possibilities for social contact reducing with every post office and library that closes and every supermarket that converts to self-service tills. For these people, I could imagine, as Simon Reynolds writes in Retromania, that nostalgia for the past has intensified because the world is changing faster. Economic transformations, technological innovations, and socio-cultural shifts all mean that for the first time there's increasingly stark differences between the world that you grew up in and the world in which you will grow old. But as I was saying this to my stepson, his face lit up as he related with a smile, yeah, but soon there's going to be this really cool thing that as soon as they swipe their shopping, what they've bought will flash up on all their Facebook pages, so their friends will be able to see what they have bought. And I said that the age distribution on Facebook is extremely skewed towards younger people, and that most elderly people don't have Facebook and they don't want it either. What do they want? I think that they might want the things that are passing us by in our reconfigured everyday imagination, time and concentration. Ed Atkins has said that his work is very much a wanting to apprehend something now, to be with it in the moment, to delineate a present. I think in the larger sense, everyone might be looking for human interaction, a sense of community, something that we could put under the general umbrella term of love. The philosopher Simone Weil describes how two prisoners in adjoining cells learn, over a very long period of time, to talk to each other by tapping on the wall. The wall is a thing that separates them, but is also their means of communication. Every separation is a link. In network culture, the link is made so quickly, and it's not made as a two-scene or an encounter, as Alan Badu calls it. As he describes it, the two-scene is a process of listening and responding. But in network culture, links now form part of a chain or a spool, moving sideways endlessly, except, as has to be said, in the case of net artists and activists like the archive team and Olia Lialina, as discussed earlier on. However, for the majority of people, the way that links work is that you're moving between the links very quickly. And in most countries, people spend between 19 and 27 seconds looking at a page before they move on to the next one. And this is what Nicholas Carr has written in his book, The Shallows, a lot about this idea of power browsing horizontally. So people are browsing, scanning, keyword spotting, one-time reading, non-linear reading. So people are spending more time on reading, but it's a different kind of reading, which he describes as being everywhere but nowhere. Clicking that you will attend an event on Facebook is not the same as actually turning up. Signing an online petition is indexically and practically different from marching in the streets. All the action is literally inside. Simon Reynolds has observed in Retromania that in the analog era, everyday life moved slowly. You had to wait for the news and for new releases. But the culture as a whole felt like it was surging forward. In the digital present, everyday life consists of hyper-acceleration and near instantaneity, downloading, web pages constantly being refreshed, the impatient skimming of text on screens. But on the macro-cultural level, things feel static and stalled. We have this paradoxical combination of speed and standstill. In Burnt Norton, T.S. Eliot wrote, "Be remembered, involved with past and future, only through time, time is conquered." So, how do we get involved with the past and the future? Simon Reynolds in Retromania notes that when I think wistfully about golden periods in my life, they all share this quality of total immersion in the now, childhood or falling in love, or phases of total involvement in current music. So being present in some way involves both time and concentration. And I think the example that he gives of falling in love is quite an interesting one. One of my favourite books is this book written by this writer called Rosamund Lehman. It's called The Weather in the Streets. And I just want to read a bit of that, which is about how she feels when she falls in love. And now the time began when there was no time. The journey was in the dark, going on without end or beginning, without landmarks, bearing, lost, asleep, waking. Time whirled, throwing up in paradoxical slow motion, a sign, a scene, a sharp, startling, lingering as a blow over the heart. A look flared, urgently meaning something, stamping itself, forever, forever, forever. There was this inward doubling, living under amorphous impacts of dark and light mixed. That was when we were together. Not being together was a vacuum. It was remembering and looking forward, drawn out painfully both ways, taut like a bit of elastic, wearing. And there were no questions in this time, all was agreeing, answer after answer, melting, lapsing into one another. Yes, yes, darling, yes, smiling, accepting, kissing, dismissing, no argument, no discussion. In this time, there was no sequence, no development. Each time was new, was different, existing without relation to before and after. All the times were one and the same. So, I mentioned before Alain Badiou's idea of the two scene and this sort of idea that's about an encounter between two people, which relates to this idea of difference that Rosamund Lehman talks about as well. So this idea that when you enter into a relationship with somebody else, it's about seeing things from the perspective of the two of you rather than just yourself. And in Alain Badiou's book, In Praise of Love, he says, love always starts with an encounter, and I would give this encounter the quasi-metaphysical status of an event, namely of something that doesn't enter into the immediate order of things. So to expand upon that, he says, what kind of world does one see when one experiences it from the point of view of two and not one? What is the world like when it is experienced, developed, and lived from the point of view of difference and not identity? And just to kind of go back to this kind of theme about supermarkets that I started off with, I wanted to read a little bit from this Ian McEwan book, The Child in Time. And this is probably the most sort of startling kind of scene in it, where the main male character loses his daughter in a supermarket. It's so hot, isn't it? I'm sorry. Now he was taking long strides, bawling her name as he pounded the length of an aisle and headed once more for the door. Faces were turning towards him. There was no mistaking him for one of the drunks who blundered in to buy cider. His fear was too evident, too forceful. It filled the impersonal fluorescent space with unignorable human warmth. Within moments, all shopping around him had ceased. Baskets and trolleys were set aside. People were converging and saying Kate's name. And somehow, in no time at all, it was generally known that she was 3, that she was last seen at the checkout, that she wore green dungarees and carried a toy donkey. The faces of mothers were strained and alert. Several people had seen the little girl riding in the trolley. Someone knew the colour of her sweater. The anonymity, I find it hard to say that word, turned out to be a frail, thin crust beneath which people observed, judged, and remembered. A group of shoppers surrounding Stephen moved towards the door, and at his side was the girl from the checkout, and her face was rigid with intent. There were other members of the supermarket hierarchy in brown coats, white coats, blue suits, who suddenly were no longer warehouse men or sub-managers or company representatives, but fathers, potential or real. In McEwan's novel, the nightmarish scenario of losing one's child makes the present elastic, charged with possibilities, and the rest of the book details the different ways in which the characters of the bereaved father and mother negotiate their loss. And in some ways, this sort of chimed when I was reading Paul Morley's moving and really excellent book, Nothing, and the passage in it where he says, how much of reality do we in the end make up to ensure some kind of survival? And how much of reality is just a compromise we've learned over generations of time between what happened, what might have happened, what happens, and what we want to happen. I was struck when watching Naheed Raza's film Frozen in Time, which also forms part of the exhibition downstairs, by the cryonics member who stated that one of his motivations was to ensure that he would not be forgotten. Famous people today will only be footnotes in history books. People think that they will live on through their children, but their children will die too. I don't want to be one of those pitied, nameless people. I was struck by this because it seemed to me that even Philip Larkin, not the most cheery or romantic of souls, was able to recognize and articulate in his most quoted poem the idea in Arundel Tomb that what will survive of us is love. Was the cryonics member afraid that no one loved him enough to remember him? Simon Reynolds observes in Retromania that the reflective nostalgic understands deep down that loss is irrecoverable. Time wounds all holes. To exist in time is to suffer through an endless exile, a successive severing from those precious few moments of feeling at home in the world. The same idea has been expressed by the psychoanalyst Stephen Gross in his interesting recent book that's called The Examined Life. And the way that he puts it is just to say that change and loss are deeply connected and there cannot be change without loss. So, I wanted to read a bit from the last interview that was given by Jacques Derrida in 2004, not too long before he died. And it's all about this idea of survival. And he said, I have always been interested in this theme of survival, the meaning of which is not to be added on to living and dying. It is originary. Life is living, or life is survival. To survive in the usual sense of the term means to continue to live, but also to live after death. When it comes to translating such a notion, Benjamin emphasizes the distinction between Überleben, on the one hand, surviving death, like a book that survives the death of its author, or a child, the death of his or her parents, and on the other hand, Fortleben, living on, continuing to live. All of the concepts that have helped me in my work, and notably that of the trace of the spectral, are related to this surviving as a structural and rigorously originary dimension. Whenever one writes, he said, one expropriates itself without knowing exactly who is being entrusted with what is being left behind, who is going to inherit and how. Will there even be any heirs? And the last quotation that I wanted to finish with was actually the first text that came into my mind when Stephen asked me to do this talk, which is a quotation from an essay written by Simone de Beauvoir in 1947 called The Ethics of Ambiguity, in which she says that it's obvious that this finiteness is not that of the pure instant. We have said that the future was the meaning and the substance of all action. The limits cannot be marked out a priori. There are projects which define the structure of a day or of an hour, and there are others which are inserted into structures capable of being developed through 1, 2, or several centuries, and thereby they have a concrete hold on 1 or 2 or several centuries. When one fights for the emancipation of oppressed natives or the socialist revolution, he is obviously aiming at a long-range goal, and he's still aiming at it concretely beyond his own death through the movement, the league, the institutions, or the party that he has helped set up. What we maintain is that one must not expect that this goal be justified as a point of departure of a new future, insofar as we no longer have a hold on the time which will flow beyond its coming. We must not expect anything of that time for which we have worked. Other men will live its joys and sorrows. As for us, the goal must be considered as an end. We have to justify it on the basis of our freedom which has projected it, by the ensemble of the movement which ends in its fulfillment. The tasks that we have set for ourselves, and which through exceeding the limits of our lives are ours, must find their meaning in themselves, and not in a mythical, historical end.